There is a phenomenon happening quietly among men over 60 that psychologists are only beginning to fully understand, and that society has almost completely misread. Men who were once social, present, engaged, and connected are suddenly withdrawing, cutting off friends, distancing from family, stepping back from relationships they spent decades building. And the people around them are calling it depression, calling it bitterness, calling it a cry for help. But what if they are wrong? What if what looks like withdrawal from the outside is actually something far more intentional and far more psychologically sophisticated than anyone around these men is willing to acknowledge? This video is about what is actually happening inside the mind of a man over 60 who decides to cut everyone off. And the answer is going to change the way you see these men completely, because the story society has been telling about these men is not just incomplete. It is almost entirely wrong. And it is time someone said that clearly and without apology. The first thing you need to understand is that this is almost never an impulsive decision. When a man over 60 cuts people off, it is rarely a sudden reaction to a single event. It is the conclusion of a very long internal process that most people around him never even notice was happening. For years, sometimes decades, this man has been quietly observing, quietly evaluating, quietly measuring what he was giving against what he was receiving. Quietly noticing which relationships drained him and which ones fed him. Quietly registering every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment when someone he trusted showed him who they actually were beneath the version they performed for him. And one day all of that quiet observation reaches a conclusion. And the conclusion is that most of what surrounds him is not worth the cost of maintaining it. That is not depression. That is not anger. That is not a cry for help. That is not a man falling apart. That is 60 years of pattern recognition arriving at its most honest and most uncomfortable conclusion. And once a man reaches that conclusion, there is absolutely no going back from it. The second thing to understand is the role that energy plays in this decision. By 60, a man has a fundamentally different relationship with his energy than he did at 30 or 40. At 30, energy feels infinite. You can give it freely and trust that more will arrive tomorrow. At 60, a man knows something about energy that younger people cannot fully grasp yet. It is finite. It is precious. And every single person and situation in his life is either adding to it or subtracting from it. There is no neutral. There is no relationship that costs nothing. And when a man over 60 does the honest accounting of who in his life is adding and who is subtracting, the results are often deeply uncomfortable because the subtractors are frequently the people he has known the longest and loves the most. And cutting them off is not about loving them less. It is about finally loving himself enough to stop paying a price he can no longer afford. That distinction is one that most people around him will never fully understand, but he understands it completely. And that understanding changes absolutely everything about how he moves through the world from that point forward. The third psychological driver is what researchers call the shifting time horizon effect. When people are young, they tend to prioritize expanding their social networks, meeting new people, building new connections, collecting relationships the way they collect experiences. But as people age and begin to perceive their remaining time as more limited, something fundamental shifts in what they prioritize. Research consistently shows that older adults begin to prune their social worlds deliberately. They become far more selective about who they spend time with, far more focused on depth over breadth, far more interested in a small number of genuinely meaningful connections than a large number of superficial ones. What looks like cutting people off from the outside is often just this natural and psychologically healthy pruning process happening in real time. The man is not withdrawing from life. He is not giving up on people. He is not becoming antisocial or difficult or damaged. He is curating his world with the precision and intentionality that only comes from having lived long enough to know exactly what actually matters and having the clear throat, courage to act on that knowledge without apology or explanation. If this is making you think about someone in your life, hit the like button and drop a comment below. Tell me whether you have watched an older man go through this or whether you are the man going through it yourself. Because this conversation matters, and the algorithm buries it every single time. Keep watching because the next part gets into the psychology that nobody ever talks about, and it is going to reframe everything you thought you understood about these men. The fourth driver is the accumulated weight of unprocessed disappointment. Men over 60 grew up in a generation that was explicitly taught not to process emotions, not to talk about pain, not to acknowledge disappointment, not to grieve relationships that let them down. So for decades, these men carried every disappointment quietly. Every friendship that turned out to be conditional, every family member who only showed up when they needed something, every person who took their loyalty for granted, every relationship that consistently cost more than it gave. And they carried all of it without ever putting it down or talking it through or asking anyone for help with the weight of it. And at some point in their 60s, that accumulated weight becomes impossible to carry alongside the relationships that created it. Cutting people off is not always anger. Sometimes it is not even a conscious choice. Sometimes it is not about the other person at all. Sometimes it is simply the only way a man who was never taught to process pain knows how to finally put it down and breathe again. And the relief that comes with that first breath is something he will spend the rest of his life protecting with everything he has. The fifth driver is the discovery of solitude as a genuine need rather than a punishment. For most of their lives, men over 60 experienced solitude as something imposed on them, something to be avoided, something that signaled failure or rejection or inadequacy. But somewhere in their 60s, many men discover for the first time that solitude is not the absence of something good. It is the presence of something extraordinary. It is in solitude that they hear their own thoughts clearly for the first time in decades. It is in solitude that they remember who they were before all the roles and responsibilities and performances began. It is in solitude that they finally meet themselves as they actually are rather than as others need them to be. And once a man discovers that quality of inner silence and realizes what has been living inside it all along, the relationships that used to fill that space start to feel less like connection and more like interruption. And protecting that silence becomes one of the most important and most deliberate commitments he has ever made to himself. The sixth driver is what psychologists call integrity consolidation. By 60, most men have a very clear and hard-earned sense of their own values. What they believe, what they stand for, what they will and will not tolerate. And they have also spent decades watching certain people in their lives consistently violate those values. Friends who are dishonest, family members who are manipulative, people who use guilt as a tool and loyalty as a weapon and vulnerability as an opening to take advantage of. And at some point in their 60s, men stop having the patience for the gap between who they are and who the people around them keep proving themselves to be. They stop making excuses for it. They stop trying to work around it. They stop pretending it is not happening. Cutting those people off is not cruelty. It is not abandonment. It is integrity. It is a man deciding that his values are no longer available to be compromised by people who never shared them to begin with and never intended to. And that decision is one of the most psychologically healthy and self-affirming things a man over 60 can do for himself. The seventh driver is the profound psychological impact of finally giving themselves permission. For 60 years, most of these men operated under a set of rules they never wrote and never agreed to. Be available, be reliable, show up. Give more, ask for less, sacrifice quietly, perform consistently, never complain. Never need too much. And the moment they finally give themselves permission to stop following rules that were never in their best interest, something shifts in them at a fundamental level that cannot be undone. The cutting off is not just about the people being cut off. It is about a man exercising a kind of personal authority over his own life that he was never allowed to exercise before. It is the first truly free decision many of these men have ever made entirely for themselves. And the psychological relief that comes with it is so profound and so immediate that it reinforces every subsequent decision to protect that freedom at all costs going forward. The eighth and most misunderstood driver is that cutting everyone off is frequently the beginning of a rebuilding process rather than an ending. The men who withdraw most completely are often the ones who are most intentional about what they are building in the space that withdrawal creates. They are not disappearing, they are clearing ground. They are making room for something more honest, more genuine, and more aligned with who they have actually become after 60 years of living. The relationships that survive this pruning process are almost always the strongest and most authentic connections these men have ever had in their entire lives. Because they were chosen deliberately and carefully by a man who finally knew exactly what he valued and had the courage and the self-respect to settle for absolutely nothing less than that. And the life that gets built in that cleared space is often the most meaningful and most fully inhabited life these men have ever lived. Here is what the psychology actually tells us about men over 60 who cut everyone off. They are not broken, they are not bitter, they are not depressed. They are not giving up on human connection, they are not damaged by their past or afraid of their future. They are not people to be pied or fixed or talked out of their decisions. They are doing something far more sophisticated and far more intentional than any of those labels suggest. They are applying 60 years of accumulated wisdom, lived experience, and hard-earned self-knowledge to the one area of their lives where they were never allowed to apply it before. Their own well-being, their own peace, their own future. And the people who get cut off are not victims of a man who stopped caring. They are the answer to a question a man over 60 finally had the courage to ask honestly. Does this relationship make my life better or worse? And for the first time in 60 years, he had the strength, the clarity, the self-awareness, and the self-respect to act on the answer regardless of what anyone else thought about it. That is not something to be fixed. That is not something to be mourned. That is something to be deeply and unconditionally respected. Comment your thoughts below and like the video if this gave you a completely different way of seeing the older men in your life.